Wichita, Navajo, Delaware, Hopi, Blackfoot, Menominee, Arapaho, Tlingit, Mandan. These are but a few of the native peoples of North America. The Native Americans made up hundreds of different cultures, with different languages, different religions, and different customs. For thousands of years, they have lived here, using the land and its bounty for food, clothing, and shelter. Then, just a few hundred years ago, explorers and settlers from Europe came to this land. When Christopher Columbus landed on the island of San Salvador, he mistakenly called the people he found here Indians. He thought he had landed in the Indies near China. Instead, he had arrived on a continent Europeans knew nothing about. News of his discovery led other explorers to North and South America, with hopes of finding riches in the New World. At first, only small groups came. Later, millions would come. Eventually, they outnumbered the Native Americans. Soon it became clear that their presence would destroy life as Native Americans had known it. This is the story of the people who were the first to live in North America, the Native Americans. We don't know much about the first people to live in North America. According to one theory, people first came to this continent from Asia about 50,000 years ago, during the last ice age. At that time, Asia was linked to North America by a bridge of land in the Bering Sea. The people who crossed this land were not explorers or adventurers in search of new land. They were hunters. They followed herds of caribou, mammoth, and bison into a new continent. They traveled from place to place, moving with the seasons and with the animals and plants that provided their food. Over time, these first people and their descendants moved throughout all of North America. Unlike ancient peoples and other civilizations, the first North Americans rarely built large stone monuments or temples. But several groups of ancient Americans did build huge mounds and platforms from dirt and stone. Dating back 3,000 years, these mound builders lived throughout the Midwest. Some of the mounds were used as burial places. Others were built for religious ceremonies. The largest was located in what is now Illinois. It is bigger than Egypt's Great Pyramid. Some 20,000 people lived in an ancient city surrounding the mound. But the mound builders' way of life ended about 600 years ago. All of their great cities were long gone before European explorers arrived. Another group of ancient Americans built their homes in the cliffs and canyons of the Southwest. The 1,000-year-old ruins of their villages can still be seen in Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. These people, called the Anasazi, made large stone buildings. One of the largest had 800 rooms. But like the mound builders, the Anasazi culture mysteriously came to an end. They abandoned all of their cities about 700 years ago. The native peoples of North America lived in tune with the cycles of nature. Their food, clothing, and shelter usually changed with the seasons. When the weather was warm, they planted hundreds of different crops. The land provided what they needed, and they held a deep respect for the land. Native Americans within a particular group shared what they took from the land, and they shared the land itself. The idea that one person could own a piece of land was unknown to them. However, native people recognized vast areas of land as belonging to a particular group. Occasionally, fights broke out over land that was claimed by more than one group of native people. The religions of Native Americans were and are tied closely to nature. Native Americans believed that all living things, plants and animals, had souls. Most believed the world was made by a single creator. And, as in most religions, they used symbolism and had stories or myths about the creation of the world. For example, the Chinook people believed that a race of undying men had become fish in order to provide food for humans. Native American religions used special ceremonies involving dance, song, and prayer to make requests and to offer thanks to the Creator. The Native American way of life depended on the land, the wildlife, and the climate found in 5 different regions of North America. The regions include the eastern woodlands, the plains, the southwest, the northwest coast, and the far north. In the eastern woodlands of North America, native peoples lived in thick forests. They hunted deer, rabbit, and other animals. They speared fish in hundreds of lakes and rivers. In wet, marshy areas, they gathered wild rice. In the summer, many groups planted crops of corn, squash, and beans. Most woodland peoples lived in small villages. Some, such as the Kickapoo and Sauk, made small round homes called wigwams from the bark of elm and birch trees. Others, such as the Iroquois and Algonquin, built large homes from wood and bark called longhouses. In the south, where the weather was warm, people made homes of branches, clay, and dried grass. After they had hunted and farmed an area for a period of time, they moved their villages to new land. Sometimes these moves led to fights. Some of the worst battles took place in an area that is now New York State. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca fought against each other for many years. But in the late 1500s, they made an agreement called the Great Peace, which ended the fighting. They also formed their own government, the 5 Nations of the Iroquois. They voted on all important matters, making the Iroquois nation one of the first highly organized democracies in North America. Native Americans who lived farther west on the plains were surrounded by endless stretches of flat, dry, grassy lands. The Pawnee, Mandan, and other peoples lived in lodges made of logs covered by dirt and grass. They farmed the land along fertile riverbanks, and they hunted small animals. But all around them, there was another source of food: bison. Once or twice a year, the plains peoples would go after these huge animals, chasing them off cliffs where they could easily be killed with spears and arrows. Later, when Spanish explorers brought the horse to North America, the bison hunt changed, and so did the lives of the people who lived on the plains. With horses, they could travel longer distances, carry more trade goods, and follow bison herds year-round. Many, such as the Comanche, Sioux, and Cheyenne, relied on bison for all of their basic needs. They used bison horns and bones to make tools, and bison hair to make rope. They made homes called teepees with bison skins and wooden poles. They cut bison meat into strips and dried it for future meals. But this way of life on the plains lasted less than 200 years. During the 1800s, white hunters killed millions of bison. They killed the bison that blocked railroads. They killed bison for their skins, and many killed bison just for sport. The slaughter of bison left many plains peoples with no source of food. Their population dropped as more and more bison were killed. By 1889, fewer than 600 bison were left in the United States. Only then did the government take action to protect bison from extinction. In the Southwest, Native Americans lived in a hot, dry, windy land filled with canyons, mountains, mesas, and deserts. The Hopi, Zuni, and Acoma peoples lived here in small villages called pueblos. Their homes, made of stone and adobe, were located near rivers. The Pueblo people were mostly farmers. They planted corn, gathered wild cactus fruits, and hunted jackrabbits for meat. The Pueblo people were not alone in the Southwest. The Navajo, who were hunters, came to this region during the 1400s. They lived in small homes made of logs and mud. They learned farming from the Pueblo people. When Spanish settlers brought sheep into the area, the Navajo became shepherds. And with the wool sheared from the sheep, the Navajo became expert weavers. Only a few native peoples lived in the harsh desert basin of the Southwest. The Paiute, Washoe, and others thrived by following the seasons in their search for water, food, and firewood. Over the course of a year, they might travel hundreds of miles looking for wild nuts and berries to pick and small animals to hunt. Farther west, in California, Native Americans lived in a land of plenty. The mild climate and the wide variety of plants and animals made it easy to find food. More than 100 different peoples lived on California's rich land. This region had the largest Native American population in North America. But the people here did not build large villages. They lived peacefully in small, widely scattered groups. Native Americans of the Northwest lived in a land of forests, mountains, rivers, and seashores. The land here was too rugged for farming. Some people in this region were hunters, but most lived along rivers and coasts where fish were plentiful. They caught a year's supply of fish when the weather was warm. They dried and smoked the fish to preserve it for the cold winter months. The Chinook, Haida, and other native peoples built huge houses, large boats, and made beautiful carvings. They traded extensively with other cultural groups and were relatively wealthy. The most powerful families collected a large number of possessions. Then, at special ceremonies called potlatches, they gave away their belongings as a way of establishing their importance within their group. Few people lived in North America's far north. The land here is frozen much of the year and food is scarce. Many Native American peoples in this region moved from place to place hunting caribou, deer, and elk. Farther north, Eskimos or Inuit survived by hunting seal, walrus, and whale. In the winter, the Inuit built igloos from blocks of packed snow. When the snow melted, people moved out of igloos into sealskin tents or sod homes. For hundreds of years, little changed in the way North America's native peoples lived. But when settlers from Europe arrived, they drastically altered the Native American way of life. In some cases, they destroyed it. At first, only small groups of settlers came to North America. The French and the British settled in the east, while the Spanish moved into the southwest from the land that is now Mexico. The Powhatan and Wampanoag and others helped the first settlers survive in the wilderness of the New World. They showed settlers what animals to hunt, what to fish, and what crops to grow. They showed them plants that could cure illnesses. In turn, the settlers showed Native Americans things they had never seen before. Metal utensils such as knives, pots, and pans made it easier for Native Americans to cook their food. Horses and guns made it easier for them to travel and to hunt. But the Europeans and the Native Americans had very different ways of life. The Europeans came from a land filled with many large villages and farms. They had large ships and castles, guns and cannons, printing presses and books, merchants and royalty. But perhaps the most important difference between the Europeans and the Native Americans was in how they used the land. The Europeans wanted to own and to change the land. Many thought the natives were wasting the land. They believed that land should be farmed to grow crops, that forests should be cleared for lumber, and that fences should be put up to mark ownership of land. The Native Americans didn't see it that way. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce declared, "The earth was created by the assistance of the sun, and it should be left as it was. It is no man's business to divide it." Native Americans didn't want the land to change, and they didn't want to move. They defended their land from settlers who took it, and the settlers fought back, usually with better weapons. Religion also played a role in the conflict between settlers and natives. The Europeans were Christians who believed their religion and their complex culture made them superior. Many of them believed that Native Americans were part of an inferior savage race. They used this belief to justify taking Native American lands and Native American lives. Some missionaries believed they could save native souls by making them into Christians. A few Native Americans gave up their religion, but most did not. The arrival of Europeans proved deadly to Native Americans for yet another reason: disease. Diseases settlers brought from Europe, such as smallpox and tuberculosis, killed thousands of natives. Many experts believe that disease killed more Native Americans than all of the wars with settlers. In the late 1600s, about 50,000 settlers lived in the colonies along the East Coast. They had small settlements, and their battles with natives were small. 100 years later, in 1790, 4 million settlers lived in the land that had become the new nation of the United States. These new Americans had their own laws, their own armies, and plenty of weapons. They controlled most of the East Coast, and they outnumbered the Native Americans. Many groups of native peoples signed treaties giving the United States land in exchange for peace. But some natives who didn't speak or read English didn't understand the terms of the treaties. And even if they had, the U.S. government often broke treaty agreements. The government allowed settlers to move onto Native American lands. Time after time, the U.S. government supported actions to take native lands and to kill native people. General James Carleton told his troops, "There is to be no council held with the Indians, nor any talks. The men are to be slain whenever and wherever they can be found." Angered by the broken promises of the whites, native leaders met and called for war. The Army then stepped up its war against the Native Americans. But in battle after battle, the native peoples were defeated and were forced to move farther west. By 1830, native lands made up only half of the United States. In that same year, Congress passed a law allowing the government to move all Native Americans to land west of the Mississippi River. Soldiers forced more than 70,000 Cherokee, Choctaw, and others out of their homes. They were moved west to a reservation in Oklahoma. Their journey is known as the Trail of Tears. But it was also a trail of death. About 4,000 people died along the way. In a matter of years, not even the western lands were safe for Native Americans. During the mid-1800s, pioneers discovered gold and silver on Native American land in South Dakota, California, and Oregon. The U.S. government broke treaties, allowing settlers to move in and begin mining. In the plains, the government offered free land to farmers and ranchers. Thousands headed west to build new lives for themselves. But many Native Americans refused to leave land they had negotiated in treaties. Bloody fights broke out between natives and settlers. Settlers who survived battles demanded action from the Army, and the United States government became determined to win what was called the Indian Wars. One of the most famous battles took place in 1876 near the Little Bighorn River in Montana. Hundreds of Sioux and Cheyenne defeated the troops of General George Custer. Not a single soldier survived the battle that is now called Custer's Last Stand. It was one of the few Native American victories. In most battles, the Native Americans were outnumbered and outgunned by the U.S. Army. Soldiers and settlers killed thousands of Native Americans. They took hundreds as prisoners of war. The last major battle took place in 1890 at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. 300 Sioux surrendered after they were surrounded by government troops. But a fight broke out and soldiers killed all 300 men, women, and children. For Native Americans, the Battle of Wounded Knee was one of the saddest days in their history. By 1890, most Native Americans had been moved to small reservations. The largest reservation, just north of Texas, was known as Indian Territory. But even there, the white settlers outnumbered the Native Americans. In 1907, the territory became the state of Oklahoma, and the natives were once again moved onto a smaller tract of land. By the early 1900s, Native Americans had lost more than 26 million acres of land. They were left to live on small, isolated reservations. Before settlers from Europe arrived, millions of Native Americans lived in North America. By 1900, there were only 240,000 in the United States. In his native language, Sioux Chief Sitting Bull told an audience of whites, "You are thieves and liars. You have taken away our land and made us outcasts." Reservation life was hard. The land was too poor to farm. Hunting grounds were destroyed. The huge herds of bison were gone. People on reservations had no way of feeding themselves or their children. Treaty agreements required the government to provide food for reservations, but often the food rations were too small or had rotted. Those who tried to leave the reservation risked death from the guns of soldiers and settlers. Reservation life was hard in other ways. Starting in the late 1800s and well into the 20th century, Native American children were often taken far away from their families to live in government boarding schools. The schools taught them the ways of white Americans. Children were punished for speaking their native languages. Children were forced to give up everything connecting them to their cultures, their clothes, their long hair, and their religion. Today, almost 2 million Native Americans live in the United States. Many live in cities, but a large share of Native Americans live on reservation lands in western states. Usually, there are few businesses and few jobs on reservations. Many people live in poor, run-down homes. Many children never finish their high school education. Some experts say that generations of pain and suffering have led to high rates of suicide and alcoholism among the Native Americans. But that is only part of the story about today's Native Americans. Many are now working to correct the wrongs of the past. They are fighting and winning court cases against the U.S. government. They're going to court to reclaim water rights, hunting and fishing rights, mineral rights, and timber rights. On some reservations, Native Americans now operate their own schools and community colleges. They have built museums to teach people about their cultures. They own and operate businesses such as hotels and restaurants. They are doctors, construction workers, police officers, and store managers. Many people have found a special wisdom in the Native Americans' respect for the land. In the last 500 years, North America has gone from a land of wilderness to a land of cities, farms, and factories. The loss of wildlife and the pollution of the air and water has raised questions about careless treatment of the land. The Native American beliefs can offer important lessons for today's world. Over time, the Native American way of life has undergone many changes, most of them forced by outsiders. But these people have not forgotten their culture. Throughout the United States, Native American parents are teaching their children native languages, songs, and dances. These people are Americans, and they have not forgotten that they are the first Americans.